The Krythar Collective, a species of highly advanced telepathic aliens, initiated a covert mission to study humanity. Unlike warlike species that conquer through brute force, the Krythars believed in subtle domination through mental influence. Their psionic abilities allowed them to read minds, manipulate thoughts, and control perceptions. For centuries, they had used these powers to subdue entire civilizations without firing a single shot, turning proud empires into obedient vassals through quiet infiltration and psychological manipulation. When the Krythar scouts first detected Earth, they saw a primitive civilization still grappling with its own nature. The humans' technology was basic by galactic standards, and their societal structures appeared chaotic and fragile. To the Krythars, humanity seemed like an easy conquest, a species that could be molded with minimal effort. They launched Operation Veil, a covert study mission aimed at understanding human thought patterns and exploiting their weaknesses. The Krythars set up cloaked observation stations in Earth's orbit, hidden from human detection by advanced camouflage technology. These stations were equipped with powerful sensors that could tap into global communication networks, monitor human media, and analyze cultural output in real time. They absorbed everything, from news broadcasts and social media trends to intimate conversations and unspoken societal norms. The Krythars believed that by understanding what motivated humans, they could influence key individuals and guide entire nations without revealing their presence. From their perspective, humans appeared fragile, physically weak, emotionally volatile, and easily influenced. The Krythars saw their short lifespans, vulnerability to diseases, and susceptibility to injuries as signs of inherent weakness. They noted the extreme spectrum of human emotions, from intense love and joy to rage and despair, viewing such volatility as a significant flaw. They assumed that through their psionic powers, they could easily exploit these emotional weaknesses, turning humans into unwitting puppets of the collective. The objective of the Krythar mission was clear: understand how humans think, identify psychological vulnerabilities, and manipulate them to achieve domination without violence. They intended to influence human institutions, from governments to corporations, using mind control techniques to reshape Earth's future according to the Krythar agenda. It was supposed to be a quiet takeover, a perfect victory without the mess of war. However, as they began their surveillance, the Krythars encountered something they had not anticipated. The data they collected showed bizarre and contradictory human behaviors. They watched in confusion as humans displayed acts of extreme violence, wars, terrorism, and crime, while simultaneously showing incredible compassion, rescuing strangers, sacrificing for loved ones, and uniting for global causes. The raw brutality of human conflict shocked the Krythars, but what truly baffled them was humanity's resilience, the ability to endure unimaginable suffering and still find hope. The Krythars struggled to process how the same species capable of committing genocide could also create art, write poetry, and build societies centered around love and empathy. They could not comprehend how humans could find strength in sadness, celebrate through grief, and channel anger into positive change. The Krythars were not accustomed to such emotional complexity. Their own culture, driven by a collective consciousness, filtered out extreme emotions to maintain stability. In contrast, humans not only embraced their emotions, but also immortalized them through music, stories, and rituals. The more they observed, the more unsettled the Krythars became. They had expected predictability, patterns they could exploit. Instead, they found chaos. Human reactions to adversity were inconsistent. Where other species followed logical responses, humans acted on instinct, hope, and sometimes sheer defiance. This unpredictability disrupted the Krythar psionic network, causing discomfort and confusion among the observers. Their telepathic minds, usually attuned to control and order, struggled to handle the emotional noise generated by humanity's chaotic thoughts. As the first phase of Operation Veil came to an end, the Krythars realized that their initial assumptions might have been wrong. What they thought would be a simple mission was turning into something far more complex. The humans were not as transparent as they had hoped. Instead, they appeared to be an enigma, a species that defied understanding. This was just the beginning of a psychological nightmare that the Krythar Collective could not have anticipated. The seeds of their eventual downfall had been planted, and they had yet to realize that in their quest to study humanity, they were opening their own minds to a terrifying truth that no alien could handle. The Thrixan researchers, in their quest to understand humanity, began an extensive study of human history. Using their advanced technology, they accessed vast amounts of information, diving into ancient records, historical texts, documentaries, and digital archives. Their goal was to map out the evolution of human society, identify patterns in behavior, and find exploitable weaknesses. What they found, however, was a tapestry of events that left them disturbed and bewildered. At first, they focused on major milestones: the rise and fall of empires, pivotal wars, and groundbreaking revolutions. They examined the brutality of the world wars, witnessing the devastation and the horrors of human conflict. They saw the trenches of World War I, the ash-covered remains of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the liberation of concentration camps. The images of skeletal survivors, the haunted eyes of those who endured, and the sheer scale of human suffering began to seep into the Thrixans' collective consciousness. But what truly unsettled them was not just the violence. It was humanity's ability to rise from the ashes. They saw how, after each catastrophe, humans found a way to rebuild. After wars, they created peace treaties and rebuilt cities. After plagues, they advanced medicine and strengthened societies. Even after natural disasters, humans banded together, showing empathy and resilience. This cyclical pattern of destruction and rebirth was alien to the Thrixans, whose culture emphasized stability and order. They could not understand how a species could thrive amidst chaos. Their study expanded to other eras, such as the Renaissance, a period where art, science, and philosophy flourished despite the remnants of the Dark Ages. The Thrixans could not comprehend how a civilization that had suffered so much could produce works of beauty and intellect. They analyzed paintings, literature, and scientific breakthroughs, but instead of finding weakness, they uncovered a profound strength in the human spirit. As telepaths, the Thrixans were highly sensitive to emotions and mental states. Normally, they used this sensitivity to manipulate other species, subtly guiding their thoughts and actions. But as they delved deeper into human history, their psionic abilities became a double-edged sword. The emotional weight of humanity's past began to influence them. They started to feel echoes of grief, rage, hope, and love, emotions that were alien to their own species. These sensations were not just abstract feelings. They were vivid and consuming, as if they were living through the experiences themselves. For the Thrixans, this was unprecedented. Their society was built on a collective consciousness that valued neutrality and detachment. Individual emotions were subdued to maintain harmony within the collective. But now, with every historical event they explored, their mental defenses weakened. They found themselves reliving human traumas through their telepathic links, unable to filter out the intensity of the experiences. One Thrixan researcher, particularly affected by the study, began to lose his grip on reality. He started to see hallucinations, visions of human historical figures confronting him. He saw soldiers from the trenches of World War I, their eyes hollow yet filled with a determination he could not break. He saw plague doctors from medieval Europe, their eerie masks a reminder of humanity's brush with death. He even saw artists like Vincent van Gogh, whose tortured mind created beauty from pain, a concept completely foreign to the Thrixan mindset. These visions became more frequent, more real. The researcher began to question his own identity, struggling to separate his thoughts from the human echoes in his mind. His colleagues noticed his behavior becoming erratic. He muttered phrases from human literature, recited lines of poetry, and sometimes wept uncontrollably, emotions that Thrixans rarely displayed. The collective began to sense the disturbance, a ripple of unease spreading through their ranks. What had started as a mission to conquer a primitive species was turning into a nightmare. The Thrixans, who believed themselves to be the masters of the mind, were beginning to unravel under the weight of human history. They had opened a door into the human experience, and now they could not close it. The more they learned, the more vulnerable they became. And the terrifying truth was beginning to emerge. Humanity's strength lay not in technology or power, but in the complexity of the human mind, a labyrinth that no alien could navigate without losing themselves. The Krythar Collective, confident in their telepathic abilities, believed that understanding human emotions would grant them ultimate control over the species. They had successfully manipulated countless other civilizations by tapping into their desires, fears, and instincts. With humans, they expected a similar outcome, a species that could be guided through their emotions, bent to the will of the collective without ever realizing it. The Krythars began their study by analyzing human expressions of emotion through art, music, and literature. They absorbed centuries of creative output, from ancient myths to modern novels, from classical symphonies to contemporary pop songs. They delved into poetry, exploring the words of Shakespeare, the melancholy of Edgar Allan Poe, and the raw honesty of modern poets. They listened to music that ranged from Beethoven's powerful symphonies to the heartbreaking ballads of lost love. They watched films and read stories that portrayed the entire spectrum of human experience: joy, sadness, anger, fear, and love. What they found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Unlike other species, whose emotions were often straightforward and predictable, human emotions were layered, complex, and sometimes contradictory. The Krythars saw how humans could find strength in sadness, turning grief into a source of resilience. They observed how humans could experience hope even in the darkest of times, creating entire religions, philosophies, and movements based on the idea that things could get better. This concept of finding light in the darkness was alien to the Krythars. Their species valued stability and order, filtering out extreme emotions to maintain a balanced collective consciousness. The idea of embracing sadness, celebrating love, or finding beauty in pain was beyond their understanding. Yet, as telepaths, they could not simply observe these emotions, they began to feel them. The more the Krythars immersed themselves in human culture, the more empathy became a dangerous trap. Their mental defenses, which worked perfectly against logical and predictable species, failed against the chaotic nature of human emotions. They started to experience not just the emotions portrayed in human art, but also the emotional states of the people who created them. Listening to a sad song did not just evoke a mild sense of melancholy. It dragged them into the depth of sorrow felt by the composer. Reading a story of triumph did not just bring a sense of victory. It overwhelmed them with the intense euphoria and relief of the protagonist. For the Krythars, this was a crisis. Their collective consciousness was not built to handle such extremes. The aliens who attempted to manipulate human minds through psionic connections were hit with powerful feedback. Instead of controlling humans, they found themselves drowning in a flood of raw, unfiltered emotions. The telepathic links, which were supposed to be tools of domination, became channels through which human feelings invaded their minds. The first signs of madness appeared quickly. Krythar researchers began showing symptoms of mental instability. Some experienced seizures as their brains failed to process the emotional overload. Others fell into paranoia, haunted by human fears and insecurities that were not their own. They started seeing visions, hearing voices, and questioning reality. The Krythar scientists who had once prided themselves on their mental fortitude became fragile, their minds splintering under the pressure. One researcher, who had spent weeks analyzing human poetry, became the first to completely break. He locked himself in isolation, refusing to communicate with the collective. The Krythar guards who approached his chamber could hear him muttering through the walls. He recited lines of human poetry, his voice a mix of fear and wonder. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" he whispered. "Though this be madness, yet there is method in't." His words shifted from one poem to another, blending love sonnets with existential musings and dark reflections on mortality. For the Krythars, this was an alarming development. They had expected to infiltrate human minds, to unravel the mysteries of human behavior and reshape it to their advantage. Instead, they found their own minds unraveling. The emotional complexity of humanity was not just a barrier, it was a weapon. The Krythars had opened their minds to human experiences, believing they would find weaknesses to exploit. Instead, they had exposed themselves to a force they could not handle. As the first scientists succumbed to madness, the seeds of a larger breakdown began to spread through the Krythar ranks. Their collective consciousness, once a bastion of order and control, started to fracture. The emotions they had absorbed from humanity were no longer confined to individual minds. They began to echo through the collective, affecting everyone. What was meant to be a quiet conquest was turning into a psychological nightmare, and the Thrixans were beginning to understand that the greatest threat to their species was not human technology or warfare, but the terrifying truth of human emotion. As the Thrixan researchers delved deeper into the human psyche, their minds began to fracture under the weight of emotions they could not comprehend. What started as a strategic study of human weaknesses had transformed into a nightmare of psychological entanglement. The Thrixans, who had prided themselves on their mental discipline and collective consciousness, were now struggling to maintain even a semblance of sanity. The telepathic links that connected the Thrixan researchers, once a powerful tool for shared knowledge and unity, had become conduits for madness. Their minds, usually able to filter out noise and focus on control, were now wide open to a torrent of human emotions. Every tragedy they studied, every trauma they witnessed, echoed through their collective mind. The Thrixans experienced not just the facts of human history, but the raw, unfiltered emotions of those who had lived through it. They felt the grief of a mother who had lost her child, the rage of a soldier in the trenches, the hollow despair of a man who had lost everything. These emotions, so intense and alien, began to corrode their mental stability. Nightmares plagued the Thrixans, both in their sleep and during their waking hours. They saw visions of human tragedies replaying over and over again. Wars, plagues, betrayals, and heartbreaks. The line between reality and hallucination blurred. They could no longer tell if the screams they heard were real or just echoes of human suffering lodged in their subconscious. The Thrixans began to experience intrusive thoughts, flashes of human lives that did not belong to them. Some started to speak in human languages, reciting fragments of conversations or historical quotes without realizing it. The inability to shut off their telepathic links amplified the problem. Unlike humans, who could isolate themselves or find solace in solitude, the Thrixans were mentally connected. Every breakdown, every flash of madness, spread through their collective like a virus. One researcher's nightmare became everyone's nightmare. One scientist's paranoia infected the entire group. The Thrixan mind, usually a fortress of order, had become a chaotic landscape filled with the shadows of human fears. Paranoia took hold. The Thrixans began to see each other as threats. They started to mimic human behaviors not out of strategy, but because they could no longer distinguish between their own thoughts and those they had absorbed. They questioned each other's motives, whispering suspicions through their mental network. The Thrixans, who had never experienced betrayal within their own species, began to feel the sting of distrust. They erected mental barriers, isolating themselves from the collective, which only worsened their isolation and confusion. One Thrixan officer, a veteran of many psychological campaigns against other species, was hit particularly hard. His mind, once sharp and strategic, was now a battlefield of conflicting identities. He could no longer tell if he was Thrixan or human. His thoughts had become a jumbled mix of alien logic and human emotion. One day, without warning, he activated an escape pod and launched himself into space. His goal was to return to the Thrixan homeworld, to warn his people of the danger. But his mind was too broken. By the time he reached the outer colonies, he had fully convinced himself that he was human. He wandered through the Thrixan outposts, speaking in human languages, asking for directions to places that did not exist. His fellow Thrixans, terrified by his transformation, quarantined him, unsure whether his madness was contagious. The collective, now more fragmented than ever, struggled to contain the spreading madness. Their leaders ordered a temporary shutdown of the observation mission, hoping that isolation would help restore sanity. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The Thrixans had looked too deeply into the abyss of the human mind, and now the abyss was staring back. What they had thought was a study of a primitive species had become a psychological trap, and empathy, once their greatest strength, had become their greatest terror. In a desperate attempt to regain control over their crumbling mission, the Thrixan Collective decided to take a more direct approach. They believed that by capturing a human and studying them up close, they could isolate the source of their psychological turmoil. The Thrixans identified a human target, a war veteran known for his mental resilience, and orchestrated an abduction. The human was taken from his home without a trace, transported to a hidden Thrixan research facility orbiting the dark side of the moon. The human, a man named Daniel Reed, had survived multiple deployments in war zones. His mind bore the scars of battle, yet he had always found a way to push forward. The Thrixans, interpreting his trauma as a vulnerability, believed he would break easily under their psionic interrogation techniques. What they did not understand was that Daniel's trauma was not a weakness, it was his armor. The Thrixans connected Daniel to their neural interfaces, attempting to probe his mind. They flooded him with illusions, dragged him through his worst memories, and tried to shatter his sense of reality. But instead of breaking, Daniel used his experiences to resist. Where other species would have crumbled under the weight of their own fears, Daniel faced them head-on. He had lived through nightmares before. This was nothing new. The Thrixans began to feel the strain. Their telepathic powers, which allowed them to connect with minds, now turned against them. When they reached into Daniel's mind, they did not find a chaotic jumble of fear and pain. Instead, they found walls, strong, unyielding, and built over years of hardship. They encountered not just memories of suffering, but also the strength that came from overcoming it. The more they pushed, the more resistance they met. Daniel, realizing what was happening, began to fight back. The Thrixans had created a two-way link, allowing him to sense their presence within his mind. He did not understand the technology, but he understood warfare. He turned his trauma into a weapon, flooding the Thrixan psyches with his own experiences. He shared the brutal sights and sounds of battlefields, the haunting quiet of post-war nights, and the persistent drive to survive despite everything. The Thrixan scientists who maintained the link began to unravel. They had expected to control Daniel, but instead, he was controlling them. One scientist collapsed, his mind overwhelmed by visions of war. Another began to scream, clutching his head as Daniel's nightmares became his own. The once pristine research facility descended into chaos, as more Thrixans succumbed to the mental onslaught. What made Daniel's resistance truly terrifying for the Thrixans was his unpredictability. Unlike other species, who might resist in logical or expected ways, humans had a unique capacity to weaponize their emotions. Daniel began to focus on hope and resilience, projecting not just his pain but also his moments of triumph. The Thrixans felt his victories, the times he had stood back up after being knocked down, the times he had chosen compassion over hatred, the quiet moments where he had found peace amidst chaos. This emotional whiplash shattered the Thrixans' minds. Their species, so used to control and order, could not handle the oscillation between light and dark, despair and hope. The human prisoner, meant to be a test subject, had become their tormentor. His unbreakable will seeped into their collective consciousness, spreading like a virus. The Thrixans began to question their own reality. Some believed they were trapped in a simulation. Others thought they had become human themselves. The lines between species blurred as the Thrixan researchers lost themselves to the power of the human mind. Amidst the confusion, Daniel managed to break free from his restraints. The security systems, reliant on psionic commands, failed as the Thrixans who controlled them slipped into madness. Daniel navigated the alien corridors, his instincts honed by years of combat. He found an escape pod, and without hesitation, launched himself back toward Earth. As he plummeted through the atmosphere, the Thrixan research station remained adrift, filled with the echoes of fractured minds. What the Thrixans had intended as a step toward domination had become the catalyst for their undoing. They had believed that by studying a human up close, they would find the key to control the entire species. Instead, they had exposed themselves to a force they could not comprehend, the indomitable human spirit. The Krythar Collective, already strained by their earlier studies, now faced the full might of humanity's greatest strength. And the nightmare was only beginning. The Krythar Collective was unraveling. After the failed experiment with Daniel Reed, the research station orbiting the dark side of the moon became a nightmare. The Thrixans who had connected with Daniel's mind were now lost in their own psyches. The telepathic links that once unified them were now conduits for madness. The echoes of human resilience, trauma, and unpredictability infected every mind in the network, spreading like a virus through their collective consciousness. The station, once a model of Thrixan efficiency, had transformed into a haunted asylum. Researchers stumbled through dimly lit corridors, whispering fragments of human poetry and reliving battles they had never fought. Some Thrixans sat in corners, rocking back and forth, their eyes unfocused as they muttered lines from human history. Others became violent, lashing out at their peers, unable to distinguish reality from the mental projections that plagued them. What terrified the Thrixans most was the loss of their own identity. The human mind had a unique ability to create narratives, to blend reality with imagination, and to find strength in stories. The Thrixans, who had always seen themselves as detached observers, were now trapped in a web of human experiences. Their collective consciousness, which once brought them clarity, had become a chaotic storm of voices, each echoing a different aspect of humanity. The alien researchers who had remained isolated from the experiment began to notice the symptoms spreading beyond the original team. The madness was not contained to those who had directly connected with Daniel. It was bleeding into the entire Thrixan network. The more the collective consciousness tried to process the influx of human experiences, the more fragmented it became. The Thrixans were turning on each other, their paranoia and fear amplified by their shared telepathic bond. Some Thrixans started to believe they were human. They adopted human names, mimicked human behaviors, and even attempted to recreate human environments within the station. One Thrixan scientist, previously a respected leader in the collective, began hosting tea parties, talking to empty chairs as if surrounded by human friends. Another painted murals on the metallic walls of the station, depicting scenes of Earth, sunsets, cities, and human faces. The artwork was hauntingly accurate, as if drawn directly from human memory, yet no Thrixan had ever set foot on Earth. The Thrixan leadership, still on their homeworld, attempted to intervene. They sent messages to the station, demanding reports and ordering the researchers to return. But their commands were met with silence. When they finally managed to force a communication channel open, all they received was a broadcast of Daniel Reed's voice, repeating a simple human mantra: "We endure, we rebuild, we survive." Fearing that the madness might spread beyond the research station, the Thrixan High Command made a grim decision. They activated the station's self-destruct protocol. Better to lose a few minds than risk infecting the entire species with this psychological plague. The countdown began, and a cold robotic voice echoed through the halls, announcing the impending destruction. Some Thrixans welcomed it, believing the end would free them from the human thoughts that had invaded their minds. Others panicked, their new human-like instincts driving them to seek escape. They fought over escape pods, some even resorting to violence. The chaos reached its peak as the station's core began to overload. Explosions tore through the research modules, and the entire structure shuddered as the countdown reached zero. From Earth, a few astronomers noted a brief, bright flash on the dark side of the moon. They wrote it off as a meteor impact or a satellite malfunction, unaware of the catastrophe that had just unfolded. Daniel Reed, who had returned to Earth, continued his quiet life, never knowing the extent of the havoc his mind had unleashed upon an alien species. The Thrixan homeworld remained silent about the incident. They erased all records of the mission, burying the failure deep within classified archives. But the collective was not the same. The remnants of the telepathic link to the research station lingered, like a distant echo. Some Thrixans began to dream, vivid, human-like dreams filled with faces they did not recognize and emotions they could not explain. The seed of humanity had been planted, and it would grow slowly and silently within the minds of the Thrixan people. The nightmare had been unleashed. The Thrixans had sought to understand and control humanity, but instead, they had opened a door into a world they could not handle. The truth was clear now. Humanity's greatest weapon was not its technology or strength, but its mind. And no alien, no matter how advanced, could walk through the labyrinth of human thought and emerge unchanged. The Krythar Collective was in disarray. The destruction of the research station was meant to be a clean solution, a surgical removal of the infection that had taken hold of their minds. But the psychological plague had already spread. The Krythar homeworld, once a bastion of order and telepathic unity, was now a tapestry of chaos and fear. The echoes of human resilience and unpredictability had taken root in the collective consciousness, unraveling the very fabric of their society. The Galactic Council, a coalition of advanced species that governed interstellar affairs, had convened an emergency session. Representatives from dozens of civilizations gathered in a vast chamber built into a floating fortress orbiting a gas giant. The Krythar ambassador, once a figure of respect and authority, now stood as a cautionary tale. His scales had dulled, his once sharp mind now clouded by human emotions he could not comprehend. The ambassador recounted the events, the initial mission to study humanity, the unraveling of the research station, and the ultimate failure to contain the madness. His voice trembled as he described how a single human mind had turned their telepathic powers against them, how empathy had become a weapon, and how the Krythars were no longer sure who they were. He spoke of dreams that haunted them, of human faces and voices that lingered even when awake. "We were wrong about them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We thought they were weak. We believed their emotions were a flaw. But they are stronger than we could have imagined. Their minds are labyrinths, and we are lost within them." The chamber fell silent. The other species, some known for their physical might, others for their technological prowess, now looked at the Krythars with a mix of pity and fear. They had always considered humanity an insignificant, primitive race on the edge of the galaxy. Yet now, through no overt action of their own, humans had brought an empire to its knees. The terrifying truth was not that humans had fought back, but that they had done nothing at all, and still the Krythars had broken. The council debated. Some argued that humanity should be quarantined, that no species should approach Earth for fear of contamination. Others believed that humanity might hold the key to a new form of evolution, one that blended the strength of other species with the emotional and psychological complexity of humans. The debate grew heated, as representatives recounted ancient myths of species lost to madness, of empires that crumbled under the weight of their own hubris. In the end, the council reached a fragile consensus. Earth would be declared a forbidden zone. No ships would be allowed to approach, and all existing data on humanity would be purged from public records. The galaxy would turn a blind eye to the blue planet, hoping that ignorance might offer protection from the dangers hidden within the human mind. Back on Earth, life continued as normal. Daniel Reed, the unwitting catalyst of the Krythar downfall, remained unaware of his role in galactic history. He tended to his garden, exchanged pleasantries with neighbors, and found solace in the quiet moments of his life. His nightmares, remnants of his experiences both human and alien, had begun to fade. He had no memory of the research station, no knowledge of the alien minds he had touched and shattered. But somewhere, in the depths of space, the Krythar homeworld remained shrouded in shadows. The once great collective, now fractured and leaderless, struggled to find its way. In quiet corners of their cities, Krythars painted murals of blue skies and green fields, their hands moving with human-like creativity. Some whispered lines of human poetry, unable to explain where the words came from. Others looked up at their pale sun and felt, for the first time, the sting of longing, for a home they had never known, for a world called Earth. The Galactic Council maintained its silence, but the story of the Krythars became a whispered legend among the stars. The legend of a species that sought to control the human mind and lost their own in the process. A tale of humanity's greatest weapon. Not their technology, not their strength, but their ability to endure, to rebuild, and to survive. And in the quiet void of space, where stars burned cold and secrets were buried deep, the terrifying truth remained. No alien could truly understand the human mind, and those who tried would never be the same again.